Hello everyone, and welcome to this next recording as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with the RICS for over 11 years now, and I sit within the standard regulatory and thought leadership part of the organisation, looking at the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 100,000 members around the world, working right across the property life cycle, all the way through land, planning and development, construction, brokerage, valuation, property management, building operations and end of life, there's obviously a hugely rich canvas upon which data and technology is having a profound effect on our sector. And indeed, with our members working right across all the different asset types of land itself, residential, rural, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure, there is a huge effect in positive terms about what data and technology is doing to the way we can provide services to our clients. And I'm really happy to have Ed Mead joining me today. Ed Mead, FRICS from Viewber. So please do join me, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Good to be here.
Pleasure as always. It's great to before we get into the kind of the bits and the bytes and the kind of the sector itself. It's always great to have a bit of kind of the human factor. So it'd be great to hear for our listeners and viewers a bit of your backstory and indeed the origin story of Viewber.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I feel I've had a very lucky past, really. I've been alive as a baby boomer at a very good time for property, and I've been an estate agent since 1979. So I've actually practiced estate agency over 6 separate decades: 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, 10s, and 20s, which is makes me sound older perhaps than I actually am. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it as a business. Worked for companies like Chesterton's, Aylesford's, always in London. And then joined Douglas and Gordon, a big central London independent agency in 1996, and stayed with them until the tail end of 2016, where I was part of the executive board running the business. As you say, I am an FRICS, and part of the fun in what I've had is that I've acquired quite a reasonable voice for myself. I wrote for 10 years as the Sunday Times property expert. I wrote as agent provocateur in the Telegraph, which gave me a really good voice to look at the industry. And there are plenty of issues with the industry, as we know. Having been an agent for all that time, I then decided that it would be far more fun to, well, I had an idea with my wife, Jamie, who was in PR and ran the PR for Savills. She and I came up with the idea of having an outside organization to be able to go and do viewings for estate agents when they couldn't do it. A lot of staff or a lot of big businesses have, like Savills, Knight Frank, Struts, these sort of businesses have weekend viewing staff or out of hours viewing staff, and I thought about doing that for on an ad hoc basis. So if I may, I'm just going to share a screen which will explain that a little bit more easily, I think. Now, this is an illustration of what we do at Viewber, which makes life hopefully a bit easier for people watching or listening to it. And effectively what we have on one side, on the left-hand side of the screen, is a property owner of some sort or a property manager negotiated within an estate agency with their instructions all over the UK. And what we wanted to do was make this a national service. What people who have an own property can do with Viewber is to then log onto our platform and book any one of these services plus more on the right-hand side. And we have over 7,000 people in the UK who are able to do work on a ad hoc basis on instruction, and it's all an online booking process. We've now done over 300,000 of these. So hopefully that helps it make a bit of sense to someone looking at that visually. Let me just stop sharing that so that it's Thanks, you and I talking. So that's what we've built up over the last 6 years, done 300,000 of them, and that's very much what I do now.
Indeed. So you mentioned earlier in your intro that but by nudging both ends of the decades, you've actually been in the industry for 6 decades. You know, in terms of the length of that. And I mean, how have you seen the buying and selling process change in that time?
Well, I think it'll be fair to say I haven't. Certain things have come along which have made life a bit easier. In terms of looking, obviously the aggregation of properties to view via Rightmove and some of the big portals on the market, Zoopla, has made life easier. But ultimately, not much has changed. Everything is still dependent upon an estate agent and a solicitor, both of whom probably, it's fair to say, still live in a much earlier era. And the only thing that's really happened in the process is people have tried to make it cheaper, which means they've made it probably slightly less effective, because the only way people can do things in that industry is to pile them high and sell them cheap. So I think there's a huge problem. Back in 1979, when I started, the average length of time taken to sell a property, I think, was about sort of 12, 13 weeks, or to exchange, to go from offer agreed to exchange of contracts. That figure is now almost double that. So something's wrong.
Indeed. I mean, so on that basis, do you actually expect it to change now? You know, given it hasn't changed over these decades, do you think there are some drivers? Do you think there's some technology? Do you think there's some behavioral things that actually will affect some change?
Yes, I think the behavioral thing in particular is a big one. I think it's a generational thing. I think back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I think people expected to be treated like that. Since then, since the mid-90s and on, we've had the advent of the web and online services, which have grown and grown and grown, and the generation that's now coming through, that's in their sort of 20s and early 30s, expects to be serviced immediately. They want what they want when they want it. And at the moment, that's being reflected in the renting process, which definitely is getting better. It's still very difficult, the process, but it is much quicker, and you can involve a lot more tech in the process for vetting and processing tenancies. But from a sales perspective, it's still very much the same. And until the people who are currently buying properties get to the age, and we know the average age of a first-time buyer is mid to late 30s at the moment, and obviously affordability is still a big issue. We can talk about that if you really want to later. Until those people become property owners, and the majority of property owners, and demand a different level of service, I don't think we're going to see much change.
I mean, in your view, in an ideal world, what should change? What elements of this process? And I appreciate there's lots of moving parts. I work on the technical side with the home buying and selling group, and you know, clearly the aim there, as you say, is to not only just reduce the time it takes, but improve the quality of the experience for all the different people that form part of the transaction. What do you think needs to change?
Well, I mean, universal identification of properties, universal identification of buyers and sellers, i.e. individuals, so that one set of criteria can be used all the way through. So when someone's been identified by the estate agent or the solicitor, that works all the way through the process. Electronic access to the land registry, etc., etc. I know that's there to some extent at the moment, but again, the identification of properties isn't necessarily 100%. And unfortunately, what you've got is an awful lot of very clever prop tech businesses. I'd love to think that Viewber is one of them, but the problem is, in terms of solving an end-to-end solution for, let's call it, the sales process at the moment, stitching together that process so estate agents or buyers or sellers don't have to log into lots of separate little apps, is a bit of a nightmare. And I think until that particular thing happens, until people really start talking to each other, which is very difficult because they're in competition, we are not involved. Well, as Viewber, we're very involved. I don't think the RICS gets that involved in the shared housing sector and the social housing sector, which is a much more collaborative sector. And although they have a different set of challenges, they do all talk to each other. Whereas in the private rented sector and in the estate agency, the residential estate agency sector, everyone's in competition. So there's a lot less collaboration, which makes the idea of producing one process that works from start to finish that much more difficult. And I don't know how to see it. I can't see a way around that for the time being.
Yeah, as you say, it's interesting where sometimes, you know, the technical solutions exist, but it comes down to kind of market behavior and market incentives, doesn't it, rather than sometimes the bits and bytes.
Well, it does. And I mean, the people who can stitch it all together really are the agents. And the problem for agents is that they've, over the last 20 or more years, a lot of them use customer relationship manager systems, CRM systems, which have evolved somewhat to now be, you know, the idea that they're modern 5-10 years ago was that they're based in the cloud and they're not sort of server based or whatever, but that's not what it's all about. The issue is that there's no universal translator. This is not a sort of Star Trek world where there's you flip open your communicator and you talk to some bloke with 5 heads and 3 feet, and the language comes through. That doesn't work with these CRM systems. So you've got some very big CRM systems that simply can't integrate with a lot of the clever tech that's. I'm not saying they can't, but I don't want to sound too provocative here, but they sort of won't. integrate with a lot of these tech businesses, even though the tech businesses have APIs available to be able to pull data and push data, webhooks, etc., etc. And until the CRM systems are perhaps more forward-looking and happier to do something which can allow tech systems to talk, allow their CRM clients to talk to tech businesses without double entry. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have. So if anybody is listening to this and they have a Star Trek style universal, and we know about businesses like Zapier and this sort of thing that can make life easier with APIs, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think that's the biggest hurdle at the moment, Andrew. And I think it's also commonplace in the conveyancing industry. In the conveyancing industry, there are lots of people using different systems, different case handling systems. Again, none of which necessarily talk to each other, let alone talk to the CRM systems that the estate agents are running. So you can see that there's a major problem. And until perhaps some West Coast style US business or some very, very well endowed business comes in and says, right, we're going to do this, we're going to give it all to you for free for 10 years, and it'll all work brilliantly, and then at the end start charging for it, I simply can't see how that's going to work.
Indeed, and I suppose it's also easy to sort of forget that the industry exists to clearly run businesses and be profitable. So for them to kind of address some of these issues, it's easier said than done. I mean, because what sort of other headwinds does the sector face at the moment, in addition to trying to digitize and improve the experience? What does the sector feel like for participants in it, in terms of trying to be profitable and invest in these kind of things?
Well, clearly, as we sit here and speak, Andrew, there are major issues with inflation. I mean, it's not helped, I've got to be honest, by the press talking about everything either soaring or crashing, which is just incredibly irritating. Of course, it puts the fear of God into people, which is not often, it's not always necessary. There's, the truth is always obviously somewhere in between. But the biggest issues that agents, I think, have going forward is how they, not only how they provide a service, but also from their own cost base, how they can turn their fixed costs into variable costs. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, okay, being an estate agent is a very exciting thing to be doing, I think. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to do it. But what you do need to do is have lots of different hats on. You need to be a good driver, a counselor, a salesman, a sales progressor. There's all sorts of things that you need to be able to do. And the truth is that no estate agent is good at all of them. The bit that is important for estate agents, obviously, is winning listings and agreeing deals. Now, those two things are the things that estate agents need to do. All the other bits in between, so the prospecting for business, the marketing stuff, dare I suggest the viewings, the sales progression, all this stuff, you can outsource if you want to. So the challenge for estate agents, I think, is number one, how are they going to get their cost base down so that it goes up and down with the business? Clearly on Christmas Day, there's not a lot going on. And clearly in April, May, there's a huge amount going on. How do you level up your human resource? Horrible expression, but how do you level up your human resource for the right thing at the right time? And the other thing is a mindset. The problem is that most estate agencies, I think, are run by people like me, middle-aged men normally, with a great resistance to change, which alludes to the point earlier that things aren't going to change perhaps until the new generation of people are running these sort of businesses as well. And I think that's a major problem. I think until that attitude changes, outsourcing is just going to be a dirty word to a lot of these people. And in my business, for instance, a lot of them are resistant to allowing a Viewber to go and share a property because they think that the Viewber is going to go and poach that instruction for one of the other people they're seeing later. Our Viewbers have got no idea what that even means. We've done 300,000 of these and never had one problem like that. But when I ask an estate agent what their biggest resistance is, they say, oh, we think, we don't want someone else knowing about our instructions. It's until these attitudes change, I think it will be difficult to engage with a lot of the tech and the things that can make the industry better. So the sector's got a long way to go.
Indeed. Now, it's an interesting thing that I always reflect on. I mean, my brother's American now, and he's lived in the States for, I don't know, 30 years odd. And having spoken to him as he's bought and sold, moving across the States, following his various jobs, it's a very different process over there. Do you think there are things we can learn from perhaps the US process in terms of how they do it and how they deliver service?
Well, I think there's a lot to learn from the US, provided people are prepared to pay US fees. As you and I both know, fees in the US are well over double what they are here, 4-6%, certainly 3% is not unknown. And intelligently in the US, people tend to have someone acting for them as a buyer as well as a seller. So the fees are split between a buying agent and a selling agent. Also, the way that estate agents operate in the US is that they tend to be more locally based and very well known. They're a part of their local community. So you will know your estate agent because you've seen him at the school, at school functions, at the local sports matches, etc., etc. It's a part of society. So I think they're also looked at slightly differently in the States. I'm not saying they're looked up to, but they're certainly looked across at rather than looked down on, which they tend to be in the UK. So it's a question of fees, and certainly the UK government has never shown any particular liking for doing anything that's going to raise fees here in the UK, which, as we know, are very low. So there's lots to learn from the US, but unfortunately, watching and admiring is different from actually taking on some of those practices.
It's interesting you make that comment about sort of people looking across rather than arguably down. I mean, what do you think is perhaps the role of professional bodies and trade bodies in the UK in terms of perhaps improving that perception in the UK and perhaps addressing some of these behavioural structural issues as well? Because I'm very mindful that there's a lot of different professional bodies, trade bodies that operate in the UK in both the rental and sales sector.
Well, they definitely have a role to play, Andrew. I think there's a benefit for most people, or they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't join Property Mark or the RICS or some of the other organizations. I think there's always a slightly cynical, as I'm sure you'll be well aware, there's always a slightly cynical angle to it. Certainly from an RICS perspective, there's an enormous amount of work that goes into being a member of the RICS, and of course you've introduced ASOC RICS and stuff, which is a little bit easier to achieve, to give one a leg up towards full membership. I think it's a difficult one. I think people, there's a big change at the moment in the UK in that there are a lot of people trying to become their own estate agents under umbrellas, which happens in the States a bit. People are, they'll use an EXP or a Keller Williams sort of umbrella, but they'll represent their own area. And those people are trying to do what they do in the US and inveigle themselves into their local community. Now, will their local community, or will anybody, a buyer or seller or potential tenant or landlord, will they look at you differently if you've got FRICS after your name, or if they know you're a member of Property Mark? I'm not sure about that. I think people are prepared to pay for quality, but I'm still not sure. I've always been a big fan of professional bodies and qualifications and this sort of stuff, but I'm just not so sure now that it's the answer. If people are qualified and really well qualified, they should charge for their services. And I always think it's one of these things where people tend to offer three sets of services: a cheaper, middle, and an expensive, and people tend to go for the middle one. And I can't help feeling that there's a bit of that needs to go on, and perhaps the whole model of professional qualifications needs to be relooked at in terms of how people advertise it. Difficult one.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads, I suppose logically to a discussion around why there is this persistence in these lower fees in the UK compared to other countries. There's this sort of sense that whether the market won't simply support higher fees, or whether almost that the industry doesn't feel it, quote, has the right to, or is delivering a level of service that would justify a higher fee, because it's a very nebulous thing to kind of understand that sort of price elasticity in terms of what fees should be payable to get the quality of service that people want.
Well, we sort of have an expensive, a medium, and a cheap, don't we? We have the sort of the free or very cheap online stroke hybrid stroke call center type agencies, which we all know about. Then we have the sort of medium, perhaps more corporate or locally based, but slightly more run-of-the-mill agents. And then we have the very expensive ones. And of course, if you own a £5 million house, you probably tend to pick an agent that you think you deserve. So we all know who those tend to be. So that's created a very good niche for themselves. Why is it difficult to get fees up? I did all my work in prime central London, where getting fees up was the average fees did tend to be a bit higher. So you know, they were the thick end of just over 2% whenever I was working for Douglas and Gordon, and that included a lot of offices in places like Battersea and Clapham and Fulham and those sort of places, not just the very centre. It's a really difficult one in terms of fees. There are lots of trainers out there who will tell you that you just need to stick to your guns, but there'll always be some Burke locally who'll try and undercut you. But I do think that it's all about quality, and I think that comes back to the people that you were talking about in terms of professional qualifications, etc., etc. I'm fairly sure that as we go forward in the future, we're going to see a lot of smaller boutique agencies which will differentiate themselves with qualifications and clever social media and clever information dispersal, and then you'll get the very good sort of top-end agencies. And I think it's going to sort of, I think that's how it's going to change. In terms of how they get fees up, I don't know then.
In terms of something we touched on a bit earlier around the kind of behavioural side, I mean, can you see the agency market becoming more collaborative in terms of the way agencies work with each other, or with you know, in your case, with third-party suppliers? Do you see a sense that it might become a different shape in terms of that behavioural piece and that collaboration?
No, I don't. It's a straightforward answer. I mean, I think the nearest you'll get to collaboration is some of these big umbrella businesses who are looking after individual agents all over the UK. That obviously introduces the ability to support those individual agents with stuff which has been tested across all sorts of other, and we collaborate with a number of those sort of organizations who make third-party offerings available to their workforce, their franchised agents, however you look at it. So no, I don't think, I struggle to see that that's going to change much.
So in terms of magic wand time, what would you do? What would you affect quickly? And I'm also thinking about some of the issues that I'm sure from your perspective in terms of Viewber, where you've got people out doing viewings, in terms of the kind of safety aspects of the industry. What sort of things have you done, or would you want to do to affect some change in the short term?
Well, I think this is not quite magic wand stuff. We've done quite a lot of survey work, working out what it is people actually want. And I'll give you an example. Estate agents have always been convinced that they have to show people around properties themselves. I'm only saying this because I know about it from all the massive data we've got back from Viewber. And our research from thousands of respondents shows very, very clearly that people don't give a toss who they're showing a property around by. They just want to get in and see it when they want to see it. Which is a classic example of the estate agent thinking, no, we have to go. And I know these days estate agents want to sell a whole load of services to buyers, but they can do that online or beforehand. So if I was going to change, or if I was going to want estate agents to change, I would want them to talk to the people they're actually dealing with and say, well, what would you like us to do? And then do it. And I think all too often in the estate agency industry, there's a desire to say, well, this is what we think should happen, so we're going to do it, rather than talking to all the people that actually use their services. And of course, a lot of people forget when they're talking about estate agents, the people that pay them are the sellers, but the people who get by far and away the most input or the most access to estate agents, people who don't pay for the service. They're applicants who are doing it for, you know, they're not paying anybody for it, but they are the people who are the future sellers. And I think for those people, if they saw their journey being made much easier by the agent, that's going to turn them into sellers that are going to come back to that agency. And so I think that's perhaps what I would do. I would like to see estate agents taking the bit between their teeth and going to applicants, the people who don't actually pay them, and saying, what would you like us to do? And then to act on it.
And how about that safety aspect? Because clearly, you know, various, you know, people who are doing viewings and inspections are to some extent placing themselves potentially in situations where they're quite isolated. What's your view on that? What have you done in that kind of area?
Well, I'm really glad you've asked that, actually. I mean, I was around, I started in 79 and I was around in 86 when poor old Susie Lampley disappeared. And clearly that scared the living daylights out of an awful lot of agents, but nothing's really changed since then. And clearly our particular business is about sending people out to do viewings and do appointments, reports, whatever it is, on their own. So we developed an app, actually, which is in the iOS store and the Play Store, I think, called Vue Buddy.
Yeah.
specifically allows people who are going into appointments that they're a bit worried about to set up 2 or 3 buddies. It could be work colleagues, friends, family, whatever, and a time limit, so that if that time limit is run over, it sends a text out to those people saying, you know, I've run over my time, can you call me to check I'm okay? And then the app, because the app's always open, once you've logged onto the app, at any stage, if you're in an appointment, you can then just simply put your PIN number and your phone number PIN backwards, and it will automatically send a text and an email to your buddy saying, I'm in trouble, you need to come and get me, with a what 3 words thing. Now, we developed that for our Viewbers, so it was very important that we did that. And then we suddenly took a view on that about 6 months ago, and we thought, well, hang on a minute, we developed this thing, so let's just give it away in the industry for free. So we've now given it. We've been endorsed by companies like Connell's, who now make it available to all their workers going out on appointments. So I think that loan safety hasn't changed at all. Clearly, mobile phones these days enable people, once they've actually disappeared, to be more easily tracked. And there are all sorts of abilities people have to track their workers better than they used to, but not much really changes. You know, people say, I remember talking to someone about a month ago, and they were saying, well, yes, we always take the telephone numbers of everybody who always comes. Well, I don't know about you, I can't even remember what my landline number is. My mobile number could be a pay-as-you-go number or a burner phone that I bought a week ago.
Yeah.
So there's so much that people think they're doing right that actually isn't necessarily particularly helpful. And I'm not for 1 second saying that Vue Buddy is a universal panacea. Nothing beats being aware of your surroundings, being careful, and taking all the usual precautions. But the straightforward answer, Andrew, is that not much has changed in the last 40 years.
Well, I suppose in conclusion, I mean, it's been a fascinating conversation as ever, Ed, but there is so much potential for change because so much could benefit from improving the process for everybody. So I guess we have to hope that actually a number of drivers here in terms of the market mean that the agency market can progress, and you know, the decades in which change hasn't taken place perhaps will lead now to some significant improvements. So.
Well, I hope so. And I mean, things like the RICS, the RICS is part of the Home Selling and Buying Group and various other things. I mean, the trouble is there are an awful lot of interested parties who are sitting sort of shouting from the sidelines and all wanting their input. It's very, very difficult. I suppose in conclusion, I would say that if you really want to sort this process out, you've got to take the politics out of it. And I think one of the biggest problems we have here in the UK is that every 5 years you get a new person coming in. Well, I say every 5 years, every 5 minutes we're getting new housing stuff. But every 5 years you get a whole change of government and a whole change of everything swings around and priorities change. And if you took property and the process of building houses, which, as we all know, is what it's all about, but then the ability to buy a place easily or rent a place easily, you need to take all that out of politics and appoint a sort of property czar, someone who can just say, right, this is what we're going to do, take a 20-25 year view, and I'm pretty sure that's the only way of solving it, rather than this ridiculous about face we get every few years.
Indeed. Well, let's hope that maybe we see some stability in that sense, in terms of, as you say, taking the politics out and having a much longer term view of what is a very long term asset. So, well, as ever, fascinating to chat, Ed. Thanks ever so much for your time today, and I look forward to catching up with you again.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and likewise, good to talk to you.